I'd like to introduce and welcome Mitchel Porter and Lindsey Parr from Diversity Role Models, who will be presenting today. Yes, I hope you find it interesting. And over to you now, Mitchel and Lindsey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you for the warm welcome, and to yourself and the Foundation for having us today. It's really great to meet everyone. As Anne's already said, really, myself and Lindsey are your presenters here today. My name is Mitchel, my pronouns are they, them, and I'm the head of digital at Diversity Role Models. Lindsey, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Lindsey Parr, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the project manager for our new DFE funded project, Embracing Difference, Ending Bullying.
Thank you. And Lindsey's actually going to tell you a bit about that project towards the end of our presentation today. And this is our agenda today, quite jam-packed. It's going to be quite a fun tour across a few bits of our work. So a little bit, first of all, about who we are as a charity and what we do. We're going to briefly touch upon some identities and terminology. We're going to look a little bit deeper at supporting transgender young people, and then also tackling homophobic, biphobic and transphobic language and bullying. You're then going to hear from Lindsey, who's going to tell you a bit more about the power of storytelling and the use of role models and lived experiences. You're also going to be able to watch one of our brand new videos. We've also got some bits around curriculum and visibility, some positive actions and resources that you can take forward into your education environments. Also a little bit on overcoming challenges and our new funded project, as Lindsey mentioned, Embracing Difference and Ending Bullying. So who are diversity role models, or DRM, as we often say for short, and what do we do? Well, a little bit first I want to share with you is about our origin story. So in 2011, when our charity was set up, or just before then, there was this family here. This is the Cooper family, and the boy right down at the bottom there with the curly hair, his name is Dominic. And Dominic was in year 9, I think, when he went on a residential trip. I believe it was to France. And as usual, the kids had some activities planned, but then in their kind of downtime, or maybe it was when all the teachers had kind of gone to sleep, the kids got up and started kind of playing some games, as they tend to in their dormitories. And Dominic and his friends played a game of spin the bottle, which is a kind of truth or dare game. And the bottle landed on Dominic, and he was dared to kiss the boy next to him. And Dominic did this as it was part of the game and it was the dare he was given, but someone took a picture of that moment when he was kissing this other boy. Now, when Dominic and his friends returned to school, that picture had gone kind of viral within the school community. Lots of people were seeing it, and then the gossip started. People were speculating whether this made Dominic gay. They asked him about it. They asked him about what he thought about it. And he didn't really know how to deal with this or cope with it. He actually found it quite distressing and difficult to deal with, and he didn't speak to anyone about what was going on with him. Unfortunately, one day, this all became too much for Dominic, and he took himself out of school and actually ended his life. Our founder of the charity, Saran Dixon, was a teacher at the time in a London school, and she heard about Dominic's story, and she herself was a LGBT teacher within a school, and she recognized and identified that this wasn't an isolated incident, that homophobia, biphobia and transphobia was still rife within school, and she wanted to do something about it and wanted to stop as many people, ideally no people, young people, to go through what Dominic went through and for similar outcomes to happen. So that is why we were set up. And so we've been going now for 11 years. We celebrated our 10th anniversary last year. And the work we do is to prevent bullying in school and to educate for inclusion. So we're a UK-based charity, and within the UK, we run workshops for young people, but also for teaching staff and broad staff across schools. We also run governor training, parent and carer workshops, and we produce resources using our fantastic role model stories. So almost all of our work involves a volunteer role model who shares a bit about their story. We really draw out those lived experiences, that storytelling, which Lindsey's going to come on to towards the end or later on in our webinar. So within our first 10 years, these are some of our amazing achievements that we're really proud of. Within the UK, we've delivered over 5,000 workshops. We've reached, I think it's more now, but nearly 150,000 students. We've delivered to over 500, nearly 600 schools, and have reached over 11,000 staff. It's our vision that we can create an inclusive education system where all students feel accepted, supported, and encouraged to be themselves and thrive. So, a brief bit then about LGBT plus identities and terminology. So, just some keywords which probably most of you are familiar with, but LGBT plus, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. We would define these words as lesbian, a woman who's attracted to other women; gay, a man who's attracted to men, or a woman who's attracted to women, acknowledging that some women prefer to use the term lesbian, some prefer to use gay, some are happy using both, but it's kind of a personal preference. Bisexual, someone who is attracted to more than one gender, e.g. men and women. And transgender, a person whose gender identity is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. So why do we bother having the plus after LGBT plus? And I often ask this to a load of secondary school students, but I think most of us are familiar now with that. There's more. We're not just talking, when we talk about LGBT plus, we're not just talking about these 4 identities or these 4 labels that people might use. There's many, many more identities that we want to encompass within the community, but also be inclusive of and educate about. So a different version of the acronym that you might have seen is LGBT plus. LGBTQIA plus or LGBTQ plus, the Q often standing for queer in this case, the I perhaps for intersex, and the A could be ally, it could be asexual, aromantic, or agender. There's lots of different A's that might stand for. So when we're thinking about these identities and kind of how we maybe think about ourselves and conceptualize ourselves, there's a few different elements that might make that up, and we find this is a really useful infographic to kind of dissect or break those down a little bit. So each of us might have our gender identity, and that could be within those spectrums of those lines you see there in the blue. Our gender expression, what we are expressing or presenting to the world, again, that could sit across femininity, masculinity, or other kind of gender expression. Our sex assigned at birth, and that's the kind of discrete variable amongst these other spectrums, so female, male, or other or intersex. Who we are physically attracted to and who we are emotionally attracted to. And for many people, those things might align, but for some people, they might think they're slightly different. So we find this is a really useful thing of breaking down that we're complex people and also that we exist across the spectrum. And also these things aren't reliant upon each other. We often think of maybe some stereotypes, you know, I'm sure we could imagine the stereotype of what a lesbian's gender expression might look like. We might imagine someone more masculine presenting, but actually these things are dependent with each other. And I'm sure if we asked almost anyone to map themselves on this and kind of place where they were on these spectrums, we could discover quite a lot of diversity about how we're actually a bit different, even if we might appear or identify in a similar way. So I want to go into a little bit more depth on supporting transgender young people, because we often find that many educators have some questions specifically around this or are looking for a little bit more guidance or a bit tentative or inexperienced. So there are what we would describe as 2 kind of parts to someone's transition. And the first part I want to talk about is social transition. So social transition is kind of how you're moving through your life as your authentic gender identity. And this can include things such as a name change, a change in pronouns, so he, him, or she, her, or they, them, as I use. There are also, though, what people refer to as neo-pronouns, neo, the prefix just meaning new, so newer pronouns that people that are kind of newer or people might be less familiar with. So Z, them is one that we've kind of put here, sometimes also spelled ZE, sometimes also spelled XE. So there are also some newer pronouns that people might use. What clothes they might wear, or how they might do their hair, for example, or present their gender identity, and also what toilets or changing rooms they might prefer to use that fit more appropriately with their gender identity rather than the sex they were assigned at birth. So when working with young people, social transition is probably the things one might notice more or want to kind of help or support with. The other side of transition is medical transition. That being the process a trans person takes to kind of physically align their body with their identity. And this might include taking hormones or having surgery, but it doesn't always. It's very much an individual choice, and different people access different things. There's no one route or kind of expected transition that one might take, even between someone who ultimately wants kind of similar outcomes. They might do things in a different order, for example, or take the steps at a time that feels right for them. You would expect this medical transition to happen with a medical provider. Within the UK, we would recommend that if a young person approached you as an educator and wanted to speak to you about this, is that they speak to their GP. Their GP might be able to refer them to a gender identity service or clinic, although access to these does vary quite a bit across the country. The other thing I wanted to mention, though, on this is that unfortunately there is quite a bit of misconception and actually misinformation out there within the media about this, which unfortunately does breed kind of confusion. So some bits of misinformation about at what age young people might be able to access hormones or access surgery. Within the UK, there are some kind of strict legal age guidelines on when these things can be accessed. For example, surgery can't be accessed before someone turns 18, although many pieces of media might have you believe differently. So a little bit more detail then on names and pronouns. So the Journal of Adolescent Health within the US discovered that they did a study which suggested that if a trans young person has just one context in which they are known by their chosen name and pronouns, this can lead to a 29% decrease in suicidal thoughts. So it really can have that quite significant impact if young people feel affirmed in their identity, and that could, as educators, be your classroom or your class, although hopefully, in fact, their whole schooling time. It's important to avoid assumptions, and one way you can do this is through names and pronoun badges. So this one's an example here, although you can also just write on a plain label your name and pronouns, and when you're introducing yourself as well. So as Lindsey and I both did at the beginning, hello, my name is Mitchell and my pronouns are they, them. It's important that we kind of do this for everyone because we don't want to assume, and quite often we might believe that, oh, we can kind of tell what someone's pronouns are, or we can make a guess at what someone's pronouns are because of the way they're presenting. But actually, many trans people for different reasons might not be presenting in a way that they want to or that matches their gender identity, but also because gender identity, as you remember thinking back to the gender unicorn at the beginning, and gender expression doesn't have to match up with gender identity. Someone could be presenting in a very feminine manner and still prefer to use he, him pronouns, and that's okay. I would also really recommend when thinking about name and pronouns to try and not put a spotlight on a trans person. So just make it part of your kind of everyday kind of practice. Don't just do pronouns when you think you might have a trans person present, or when you know there to be a trans person present, or kind of put them on the spot. Sometimes we make mistakes. I've made mistakes before. It's totally okay. The best thing I can recommend is that you just apologize quickly and move on. Don't labor the point or kind of make a big deal about it. Just quickly correct yourself. So Mitchell, they said this, for example. Dead naming might be a new term to you or might be familiar, but it's the word we use to describe when you use someone's old name, I guess more specifically a trans person, although not many other people other than trans people are necessarily changing their first name. And by dead naming, we don't really mean the occasional mistake or slip up. It can mean that, but we also want to draw your attention to how it can be malicious and hurtful. People can sometimes intentionally or kind of weaponize dead naming and might even play it off as an accident or a mistake. This is actually a form of transphobic bullying, which many young people say often goes unnoticed by adults who are working with them. So when working with trans young people, it's important to take a child-centered approach. Remember that each trans person is an individual and they're going to have different needs, and ensure that you are being led by that young person in your approach and making reasonable adjustments to ensure that they're comfortable. Try not to assume or second guess what you think will be the best thing for them. There's some really fantastic National Education Union NEU guidance, which actually one of our colleagues helped co-write. So I really recommend you check that out. But within that, some things that they suggest are things you might want to discuss with the young person or their family initially, which could include just simply, how can we help you best? Have you spoken to anyone else about your feelings or gender identity? How do you wish to express their gender identity? Which name and pronouns do you wish to be known by at school or at college? It's important to note that this might be different from what the young person uses at home or what they want to use at home at the time. It's also important to note, and we're going to revisit this a little bit later on, but that coming out as trans in and of itself isn't a safeguarding issue. So it doesn't have to be raised unless you think there are factors within that or circumstances surrounding that that would cause that young person to be in danger or be vulnerable to any kind of danger. You could, if you raised a safeguarding issue, if that led to a family being formed, actually be causing a greater safeguarding risk, because it might be that the young person doesn't feel that they can safely, or just even that they're not ready to come out to their family at home. So it's really important when disclosures around gender identity or trans identity are made, that we think about confidentiality. So a few more bits of guidance on this specifically are summarizing a few points I've made already, but just to take a child-centered approach and ask what support they need. Be conscious about the pronouns that you use and collective nouns when addressing the whole class. So try to avoid, rather than saying girls and boys or come on girls, if you're working in a single sex school, you could say come on year 8s or come on biologists, for example. Ideally, you could look to adapt your uniform list to be gender neutral. You could consider having some, not necessarily all, non-gendered or gender neutral toilets, bearing in mind one gendered toilet at the end of one school campus might be quite difficult to access for someone who has classes all around a large school campus. You could nominate a member of staff to be a trans specialist within your teaching or staff team. You could offer support in educating other students and kind of sharing out information, and look to tackle transphobic language and bullying. Okay, so a little bit more then on looking at tackling homophobic, biphobic and transphobic language and bullying. So, as I just said, homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying or language. We also call this HBT because it's a bit of a mouthful for short, so bullying or language. So what does HBT bullying look like? So you might have had some ideas to mind, and the fact is that actually HBT bullying can look like a lot of other kinds of bullying as well, and there's certainly overlap. However, there are some specificities to HBT bullying that might not necessarily appear in other kinds of bullying. So some of the commonalities perhaps are physical bullying, name calling, rumors and gossip, avoiding an exclusion. But some other things that might be more specific are threats of being outed, so disclosing that someone's gay, lesbian, bi, trans, etc., their identity, comparing them or kind of stereotyping them to LGBT celebrities or characters, particularly if those are negative characters or people in the media. Name calling or HBT language, dead naming or wrong pronouns, as I mentioned before, specifically with trans people. There might also be sexualized language or inappropriate questions. You know, you're gay, how do you know that? Does that mean you've done X, Y, and Z, or etc.? So what's the picture then? So there's been a few different bits of research into LGBT life for young people in schools within the UK. So I will save these statistics, although quite a few of these reports are fairly recent. They are all UK based. So within the UK, 43% of LGBT plus young people say that they are bullied for being LGBT plus. However, that jumps up and is considerably higher representation among trans young people. It's nearer over 60%, 64%. 86%, meanwhile, hear phrases like that's so gay or you're so gay. So that kind of normalized sort of banter or more casual homophobic language that might happen within any environment, sometimes obviously out of earshot of a member of staff. And 45% of those bullied never tell anyone about the bullying. Meanwhile, only 27%, just about a quarter of secondary students, say that their school would be safe for LGBT people to come out as LGBT+. So really quite a low number of students who perceive schools as a safe environment to be openly lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or any other LGBT+ identity. And 42% of LGBT secondary students report that HBT bullying is common at the school. However, it's half the number of those who don't identify as LGBT+. So LGBT+ students are definitely more aware and report that HBT bullying is more common at their school than those peers who don't identify as LGBT+. So what's the impact of this? 40% of those who've been bullied say that they skip school because of it. 84% of trans young people have self-harmed, and in fact 45%, nearly half of trans young people have attempted to take their own life. This is quite a bit lower. It's nearer to 1 in 5 of lesbian, gay, and bisexual young people. 43% of staff are unsure if colleagues would be comfortable coming out at school, so nearly half. So who's affected by this? HBT language and bullying affects students who are LGBT+, many of whom know that they're LGBT+, by the time they're 13, but also any other students who have friends or family who are LGBT+. It can also affect those who don't conform to gender stereotypes. And I really recommend checking out. We have a few role model stories, I believe. I can think of one in particular of a straight cisgender man who considers himself an ally, but who within his schooling time was still subject to homophobic bullying because he didn't conform to those gender stereotypes that were expected of him. And then more generally, those who are perceived to be different, and it can affect staff too. So that's all quite a lot of kind of doom and gloom, but there is definitely good news. There is real research and backing to show that students in schools that teach about LGBT issues feel that they are more part of the community, that they feel safer, happier, and more welcome. They're more likely to have someone to talk to, and they're less likely to say that bullying or language is common. So teaching about LGBT issues really can have quite a significant impact. So keeping an eye on the time, I feel like I'm going over. So I'll just talk then a little piece about a few scenarios. So one here is a student comes up to you after a lesson and tells you that she is pansexual. She wants to know if you think that her classmates will, and wants to know if you think that her classmates will react badly. She says that her parents know and are supportive, but she's worried about being bullied. How do you respond? So you may recall I mentioned earlier, coming out in any context is not in and of itself a safeguarding issue. So you can offer to keep that confidential if they want to, and indeed you can do, but you could offer to share that with other staff if they wanted to, or if they just want other staff to be aware, e.g. the head of year or another member of staff that might be appropriate. If a student comes out to you, please make sure that your response is supportive. They'll probably be quite anxious or nervous about how you're going to respond, and sometimes you might have to go a little bit above and beyond, because even a neutral kind of response can seem negative, even if it's just a bit underwhelmed. That can make someone feel almost like, why was I so nervous, or why did I feel that way, or why was I worried about it? So do make sure your response is supportive. Ask if they feel like they have enough support and if they need any further support from the school, and ideally have a list that you can signpost to straight away of kind of organizations or safe spaces that they could go to if they wanted more. Meanwhile, a scenario on HBT language: you're in a corridor before a lesson starts and you overhear a student say, "Don't be so gay," to another student. some responses. You could talk about, there's quite a few different angles you can take with this, but you could mention about, you may not have meant to be hurtful, but when you use the word gay to mean something bad or stupid, it is hurtful. Questioning their use of that language. What did you mean by that? What are you intending to achieve? What do you mean by gay? You could go down a route of asking, would you use racist language in the same way? Why or why not? Now that you know what it means, and this was kind of a specific scenario of, someone saying, oh, your shoes are pink, they're so gay, but is it possible for shoes to be gay? So how to eradicate HBT language? And this is a really fantastic cycle that we like to come back because it does kind of all connect. But it's important to educate on why it's offensive, consistently challenge it, monitor and log all incidents of HBT language, especially bullying, but also language. So that instance and the example of someone saying that's so gay. Sanction if consistently used, and empower young people to challenge it themselves. So when they hear their peers say it, they feel empowered to be able to say something as well. And it goes back around in the cycle again. Okay. Overcoming some challenges then. So one challenge that you might face is parental concerns. So in this example, if you're in a playground and an irate parent arrives at the end of the day and demands to speak to you about a lesson you delivered on diversity, and they said something along the lines of, you're teaching my child to be gay, this isn't what I sent my child to school for, how could you deal with that situation? So our advice would be, and again, I'll stress that some of this is quite specific to the UK in terms of the legislation surrounding kind of protected characteristics. But the work that we're teaching has core values of kindness, respect, and equality. It's not about teaching children to be gay. You can't teach someone to be gay. I know many people, LGBT people, who say, well, if that worked, if you could teach people to gay, many people try to teach me not to be gay. It really doesn't work in that way. So some other things specific within the UK are the Equality Act of 2010 and Ofsted both place duties on a school to tackle LGBT-based discrimination and promote equality, and teaching about these identities, as we kind of mentioned about earlier, helps with tackling that discrimination and promoting equality. Our school is inclusive of everyone, and we celebrate diversity of families or identities in the community, and the work is part of the compulsory RSE relationship and sex education. And parents have no right to withdraw from relationship education. So this is specifically, we're not talking about sex education within this point and what that might look like within LGBT identities or outside of that. But relationship education, these identities, is within the UK a compulsory part of our RSE curriculum. And so parents do have no right to withdraw their children from their education. Some positive strategies for parental concerns. We really recommend some clear communication, addressing misconceptions, especially if they're widespread or they're coming in quite a lot. You could consider having meetings and workshops with parents and carers, making resources available, particularly if you're using them or if there are any concerns or confusion about what's being used. Share the impact of the work and why students value it, and share how the work aligns with the school values. It's also really important to remember, and we do want to stress this, that 94% of people think that it's important that children learn about LGBT plus identities. So parental concerns, we would hope, and probably should be few and far between. The vast majority of parents in our practice and within our work, we find are often feel positive about the work that's being done around inclusion. Okay, another challenge that many people note is that of religious concerns. Our scenario here being that informed time when discussing a local pride event, a student says, gay people will all go to hell and that shouldn't be celebrated, they should be locked up. How could you respond to this? So our advice for this is to share that at the core of all religions, they teach love, kindness, and respect. That is kind of the universal kind of teaching of all religions out there. Religious belief is not a justification for discrimination, and religious leaders within all religions have condemned homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. Not all religious leaders, but there are leaders within each religion that have been spoken more positively about LGBT inclusion. Legal rulings show that freedom from discrimination does take precedent over other rights. Our example here is there was quite a famous ruling, I believe, within the UK about a bed and breakfast, where the religious owners within the bed and breakfast tried to refuse service to some LGBT patrons. And despite the fact that both religion and belief and sexual orientation and gender reassignment are protected characteristics within the Equality Act, neither can discriminate on the other on the basis of their protected characteristic. There's also a really wide range of beliefs within any religion, and there are LGBT people of all different faiths. So I would really recommend, if you had particularly a young person who was of a particular religion and they really felt like their religion and LGBT identities could never overlap or weren't compatible, you try and point them towards some organizations that kind of look more at that intersectionality, or some role models who are of that faith and LGBT plus.
Thank you, Mitch. That was fantastic. You can see from kind of our founder that stories can be incredibly powerful. It was that story of Dominic Crouch and his lived experience and the lived experience of his family that led to Saran setting up DRM, and it still forms, you know, the core of the work that we do. Our role models sharing their lived experiences. So I always use this to kind of highlight it, and I always ask two questions. So the first question is, what did you have for breakfast 3 weeks ago? And the second one is, what did Goldilocks eat when she visited the three bears? I guarantee you probably find it easier to answer the Goldilocks question. And that is because stories kind of are embedded in our minds. We remember them, they impact us. Even fictional stories and even fairy tales that we haven't heard for years and years, they still resonate and they still stick with us. And that's because stories can be incredibly powerful. And they are everyday life. When we think about what a story is, it goes beyond physical books and media outlets. It's every interaction that we have has a story, and these stories shape how we see the world and how we engage with the world around us. I really like this quote from Edward Miller, but it's this idea that stories bring order into our confusing world. And think about how many times a day we kind of interact with people and have a story as a result. And it's those stories, those lived experiences that we harness in the work that we do at DRM. And our storytellers, if you just move on, Mitch. So our storytelling for us is the art of kind of sharing that interaction and sharing those human experiences. And for us, it's those stories that our role models tell that really can educate and change attitudes and beliefs. They have the power for us to embed empathy and break down barriers. And that's certainly kind of what we've seen in the 11 years that we have been working with our fantastic role models and continue to work with them. For us, the role model stories kind of are twofold, and there's been a lot of kind of research around this. First of all, as we bring a role model into the classroom, whether that be via our multimedia platforms or whether that be a live role model taking part in a staff training, a workshop, a governor training, it's visibility. It's that person's identity being represented, and it instills an understanding for the listener. And it's intersectional as well, in that often the role models we use have a range of identities and a range of experiences that they can share. It's more kind of the listener and the change that can create for me that makes the role model story such a fantastic tool. They've done lots of research around this, and as somebody listens to a story, there is a release of oxytocin, which is a chemical that is key in kind of us being empathetic. You'll know if you've ever seen any kind of story, even if it's fictional. So I'm thinking maybe like Aslan in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. We know it's fictional, but that empathy that we feel for what that character is going through, you know, can still provide that lump in the throat. And as we bring lived experiences to the classroom and that oxytocin is released, it really does embed empathy in the listener. And you can think about the change that can bring about in our young people, which is incredible. They've done a lot of stories as well, and it's something called neuro mirroring. That's when we kind of listen to stories and we're able to actually feel what the listener felt and what the listener experienced. And stories can be that powerful. And in fact, you know, lots of people have used the power of storytelling in the past. You know, we use the example of the Irish abortion referendum. So when the abortion law changed in Ireland, 77% of those surveyed who voted in favour of that said it was because they'd heard of a lived experience of somebody kind of, you know, seeking an abortion, and that lived experience changed their views. And we think that this is certainly kind of how our role models work within the classroom and the work that we do. You're also 22 more times more likely to remember something if it's told in story form than you are if it's just plain facts, which is why I used Goldilocks at the beginning there. And these stories really can bring about an attitudinal change as well, just based on kind of like the science that I've said there, and that embedding of empathy. Can you just move on? Thank you. I've already said the heart of what we do. So our workshops have a live role model that students can interact with. The biggest part of this for me is the ability to ask questions at the end, and the way that the role model creates a safe space for the young people to do that. But it is a significant part of our staff training and all our wider training as well, and our resources, which we're going to share with you in a minute. And that leads us on to, so this is one of our brand new role model stories that we filmed for our new project. So we are an LGBT plus charity. So a lot of our role model stories are sharing identities within that community. But the DFE funded project actually covers the protected characteristics. So our new videos and future videos, as we record them into year 2, will cover even more of the protected characteristics beyond LGBT+. I'll let you have a little look at one of our videos. They really are fantastic, and I'll explain how we use them and the resources that we provide.
So I've always considered myself a bit of a late bloomer when it comes to coming out. I didn't identify as gay until my late teens, but it's funny to look back now because there were definitely moments and signs that should have made it obvious to me. But I'm from a small countryside village and I didn't know any gay people. The words gay, lesbian, LGBT+, were just not used at home. And in school, Section 28 was still in effect, so teachers weren't allowed to talk about homosexuality. And so it meant that I didn't have a frame of reference or language to understand how I was feeling. It was early into my A-levels when I really started to understand that my feelings and my attractions were different to my male friends. But I still didn't know anyone else like me, so I kept everything secret. As time went on, I realized that I was gay. I think essentially down to maybe one character I'd seen on TV at the time on a show my mum was watching that helped me connect the dots. As I was finishing A-levels, it had become harder to keep my feelings to myself and to not have these conversations. So I knew I wanted to come out. I can't tell you much that comes close to the fear of coming out to someone that you love, the worry that they'll see you differently and that they won't support you. Coming out to my family was a completely different story. With my friends, I knew that if they weren't supportive, I could find new friends. Eventually, I would go to uni, I would get into my working life, and I'd be able to find people I could choose to be around that were loving and supportive. But with your family, you don't get to choose them. And at that time, outside of the occasional use of the word queer or gay in a derogatory way, I wasn't even sure that my family understood what gay was. Since coming out to my family, the interesting thing is I still don't necessarily feel that comfortable to have conversations about being gay or about my wider community, because it's the lack of their perceived desire to have these conversations that kind of leaves you feeling a bit more tolerated rather than celebrated. And I think it's really important to reaffirm to LGBT plus people in your life that you are there for them because of who they are and not despite it. Most of my family were really supportive. My brother took a little bit longer to come around to it. I think for him, he thought it meant that I was suddenly someone different, that I'd been hiding who I was and that this gay Neil was someone different. And his head was filled with a lot of stereotypes about being gay that he suddenly expected me to be. And it's these stereotypes that have followed me throughout my life, starting from coming out to my mum and asking her if she'd ever thought that I could be gay, and her reply being that she had thought about it, but it was just because I was loud and confident, liked theatre and was caring. Or work colleagues deciding that I could be gay because I happened to sing along to part of a Beyonce song that was playing on the radio. All things that are true and that I love, but just have absolutely nothing to do with the fact that I'm also attracted to men. On the flip side, though, as a gay man, I can also then be made fun of for liking things that are considered traditionally straight or masculine. My gay friends were completely shocked when I told them that my partner is an avid footballer. And it doesn't sound like much, but it's really exhausting, and it can make it hard to do the things that you love when people make you feel different for liking it. And for me, it's this mix of the stereotypes that put upon us and the lack of these usualizing conversations around being gay that have made it hard to come out over the years, or have at least kept that fear present for me. I don't think it can be underestimated how much power someone has as a friend or a peer or a teacher or an adult that supports a child to make their life easier just by the references and examples and conversations that they have naturally. Because I know for me that if I had heard these examples and heard of people like me growing up, it would have made it a lot easier, and I would have felt a lot safer to show who I was.
I really like Neil's example because it just kind of brings together everything that we're kind of trying to get across in the webinar. And I'm sure you'll agree, really, really kind of powerful story. And we would use that to explore a range of things with young people, coming out, stereotypes, being your true self. You know, that there's lots of kind of angles that we can go down with that. Our role model stories are always kind of highly thought of. You can see some of the feedback from teachers and students about the power that these stories can have, whether that be in live form or whether that be using one of our wonderful multimedia resources. They are all available on Vimeo on demand, so I'll pop the link in the chat at the end of the Q&A, and feel free to ask me anything about them. It leads on wonderfully from what Neil said there about kind of visibility, and saying that he really wished that he'd had visible role models and people that kind of represented his identity. And you know, 74% of LGBT plus pupils have never had positive messages from their school around being LGBT plus, and as a result there have contemplated suicide. But this drops when we provide those positive messages. And you know, it really is important that we improve this visibility, and representation does matter. If you can just pop on. Thanks. And so it's just some quick wins to kind of promote visibility in your establishment. Visible staff allies, you can do this with badges, lanyards, sometimes rainbow lanyards, stickers on doors, creating safe spaces for LGBT plus students. That consistent challenge to HBT language is a massive one, and Mitch has been through that cycle of kind of how to be consistent with that. You know, posters, inclusive displays, assemblies and form time activities around sexual orientation, gender, you know, picking out key events like Pride Month, like LGBT plus History Month. But the biggest one for me is this being inclusive in your language and your examples. And this is something we actually call usualizing. It's a phrase that we've actually stolen. So we have referenced it there. It used to be, it's probably something you more as normalizing, but we don't like to use that word because it implies that something wasn't normal. So we do actually use the term usualizing. I think, Mitch, if you've got the usualizing slide. This is just about representation. So utilizing is when you make present people of all different identities in what you do, but the point is the non-comment. The actualizing follows, the study of kind of LGBT plus identities follows, but they should be represented in your classroom, in your establishment, in the examples that you use. So maybe have a think about how you could do that in the context that you work in. But this utilizing, this representation can be incredibly powerful. Also, if you think about like the contact hypothesis, and the more that people come into contact with these different identities, less prejudice will exist. And they've done lots of studies on this, and utilizing helps with that contact. What follows utilizing is actualizing, which should be my next slide. There we go. And this is when you make real these identities in the minds of the learners. So you then study these things in more depth. But they're done without any distraction, because the young person is used to hearing about these identities. It's not new to them. It's not a surprise to them. And then they can study these things in depth. I've got a couple of examples for you just with LGBT. So if you look, two examples from maths and RSE or PSHE, you can see the utilizing example there from maths. You know, it is just simply utilizing the fact that there is same-sex marriage and that a woman can be married to another woman. Often when you find examples in kind of subjects, they don't utilize the presence of different identities, and it is really important that we do that. But then obviously the more we're utilizing that, it makes the actualizing much easier. So I've given you an actualizing example where you actually explore kind of LGBT plus relationships, and this is just a younger one, but just doing it through the book Tango Makes Three, which is about two daddy penguins who end up adopting a baby penguin. It's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But utilizing can be so powerful, and something that really will bring forward inclusion. Gone back to prejudice language there. Not sure why, Mitch. So just to kind of draw your attention to our videos, we're launching even more on the 20th from our year one project that cover a range of themes, but that's just some of the themes that are covered there. You can find them on Vimeo on demand. They actually come with, if you just move forward, Mitch, they actually come with suggested activities as well. They come with suggestive outcomes. They give an outline of the video. They come with suggested extension tasks. So, and they are free to access. So, you know, this is something that you can kind of take forward and use in your classroom and drop these activities in and use them how you see fit, but using that power of that story to embed empathy. I would recommend that you use students' invisibility as well. Students can be incredibly powerful as well in kind of embedding inclusion. You know, think about equality groups, think about student-led kind of activities. Certainly assemblies, student-led assemblies can be incredibly powerful. I am just mindful of time. I'll leave you with, I will put a leaflet about our new funded project, but our new funded project, Embracing Difference, Ending Bullying. We use these 4 pillars of success in our training with staff. So we look at policies and processes, curriculum and education, values and visibility, and training and development. And we do include one of the stories from our wonderful role models, a live story as well. So there is a Q&A, and it's all about prevention. It's all about embedding inclusion to prevent bullying, and that's bullying across all the protected characteristics, and we focus based on the school's needs. It has a package from start to end, which involves surveying, self-assessments, the training, an action plan, multimedia resources, sharing our best practice guide, and for 25 lucky schools in year 2, we are actually providing pupil workshops as well. We can fund 150 places for staff training in year 2. Year 1 was fantastic and successful. We delivered to 55 schools, 10 workshops, and we've recorded 15 role model videos, and we've got 10 lots of resources going live in our webinar on the 20th. But you can see there for year 2 that we do have funding for even more free staff training and pupil workshops. So anyone that's interested, I'll pop that all in the chat and that information in the chat. Like I say, we've got our new videos, we've got our resources. And so over to Q&A. I think I did really well there in terms of speed, Mitch. Would you agree?
You did fantastically well. You really did. Thank you both for some really interesting information.